Hi everyone, today I'm going to continue the discussion from the previous video about Soviet tank destroyers. In the last video we learned that Red Army troops who fought tanks using Molotov cocktails or anti-tank grenades or grenade bundles, etc. were referred to as tank destroyers. Now the question is, are other vehicles that primarily fight tanks, are they also called tank destroyers even though they themselves are tanks? So the answer is yes. So the earliest I've seen referring to a tank destroyer or a tank as a tank destroyer in reference to the Christie tanks purchased by the Soviet Union in 1930. The Christie tank was called that because of its high speed. It didn't have a gun at the time, but the discussion about how if you put a high velocity 37mm gun on the Christie tank, it's going to make a very good tank destroyer. So it seems that the Red Army had similar ideas to what the United States Army had with high-speed, mobile, relatively thinly armored tank destroyers. Other tanks, such as the T-34 in the picture that I showed you, have been called tank destroyers as well, again referring to the role, not the type of vehicle. I've also seen this in reference to the Valentine tank, specifically the Valentine 9 with a 57mm 6-pounder gun. This was from a tank brigade that used both Sherman tanks, some 4A2 tanks, and Valentine tanks. The Valentine tanks not come with high explosive ammunition, so you couldn't really fight infantry, where the idea in this brigade was you would take Sherman tanks would accompany infantry and attack village or whatever objective that they had to take, and Valentine tanks they would make up an anti-tank reserve where their job was specifically to attack enemy tank counterattacks, so counterattack and destroy enemy tanks, and as such they were referred to as tank destroyers. Even though they weren't, Valentine isn't really a fast tank like the American tank destroyer concept would call for. But let's double back a little bit to the T-34 in the picture. This is probably one of the most mythologized variants of the T-34, and as you probably have seen from my video on T-34 myths, is already a tank that is covered in misinformation. So a lot of you might ask, well, what's the name of this tank? You might know this, you've read it probably. If you play World of Tanks, you know it's called T-34-57. Read a couple of articles that are out there somewhere. You probably call it Exterminator. The truth is that neither of these names was ever used. In actual Red Army documents, the T-34 with the ZIS-4 57mm gun is called 34. It's called T-34 with the ZIS-4 gun, T-34 57mm gun, but the index T-34-57 was never used. As you can see from documents, the T-34M that was also supposed to be produced with this gun was also going to just be called T-34M with the ZIS-4 gun. There's no special name for it. As for the name Exterminator, that was, you probably know that Soviet tankers weren't really in the business of their tanks like, say, the British and the Germans. The name Exterminator is a mistranslation. As I mentioned in the previous video, the Russian word Истребитель translated as a number of things, one of which is Exterminator, but calling the T-34 with the ZIS-4 Exterminator, you might as well call it fighter jet. That's about as accurate of a translation. The documents referring to it as Истребитель call it Истребитель танков. It is a tank destroyer, not have any fancy nickname. So there are equally many misconceptions about the history of this tank itself, so let's go through it pretty quickly. The T-34 tank at the time, in the spring of 1941, had just received the F-34 76mm gun. This gun was capable of penetrating 50 to 60 millimeters of armor at pretty much any effective combat distance. No concern whether or not you could deal with German medium tanks. However, Soviet intelligence has learned that the Germans were working on heavy tanks with up to 90 millimeters of armor. These were called the Type 5, Type 6, and Type 7. Now know that none of these tanks were actually built. If you map their parameters to tanks that the Germans were developing at the time, such as the VK-6501. You could see some matches, so it's probably information was obtained. And intelligence goes, it's not exactly reliable all the time, but there is some historical basis for it. However, the USSR had absolutely no way of knowing that these mystical tanks actually exist. And so, in addition to a number of other tank programs that was launched, it was an idea to equip the T-34 with a high-velocity anti-tank gun. The ZIS-2 57mm towed anti-tank gun had just put into production, so naturally the idea was, get into on the F-34 gun mount, easy peasy, you got yourself a tank destroyer. This gun was capable of penetrating up to 90mm of armor at 1,000 meters at normal, or 70mm at 30 degrees. So it would be capable of fighting all of these German heavy tanks that might show up in the coming war. This tank was in May of 1941, built in April of 1941, was tested in May of 1941. Trials showed that penetration was impressive. However, there were two very serious drawbacks. One was that the barrel lifespan was only 900 rounds. This is a common drawback for guns. High velocity, high pressure means that the rifling wears out faster, and the barrel has to be replaced. So that was actually not optimal. The other drawback, probably more serious, was precision. So it had worse precision than the T-34 with the 76mm gun, with the F-34 or the L-11. It's not particularly useful to be able to penetrate 90mm of armor at 1,000 meters if you can't hit anything at 1,000 meters. But the concept of a high-velocity anti-tank gun in a tank was deemed correct, and so a reworked variant of the ZIS-4 gun went into trials in July of 1941. At that point, the war had already started, but they decided to keep going with this program anyway. The second iteration of the ZIS-4 was actually pretty good. Trials showed that it could no problems hitting a tank-sized target at 2,000 meters. Stability, precision all improved. Barrel lifespan was improved. However, the German tanks with these ridiculous amounts of armor, they never turned up. And so there's never a large amount of these tanks built. There were only 22 gun barrels delivered to factory number 183. But there were only 10 sights delivered for the 57mm gun because of the different ballistics. The ZIS-4 used a Team of D8 sight, different than the sight used on the F-34. So you had 10 sights, you could only build 10 tanks. Very commonly heard rumors, Red Army tanks weren't built without sights. So, we had 10 tanks. All these tanks were assigned to the 24th Tank Brigade in September of 1941, and they were all lost in battle during a raid at Kalinin, modern-day Tver. But the story of the T-34 with a 57mm gun does not end there. In 1943, specifically in January of 1943, the Red Army captured 2 Tiger tanks. Trials held in April of 1943 showed that its armor was actually pretty tough and resisted very well against the 76mm F-34 and ZIS-5 guns. But even before these trials were held, the GOP2 remembered that, oh hey, we have this 57mm gun design back when that actually proved itself pretty well, and so it was put back into trials at first, not production. There were only 4 of these tanks built. The trials were conducted in August-September of 1943. We also hear that these 4 guns, they were called ZIS-4M, such thing. The index of the guns remained the same, even though they were likely changed somehow in minor design elements. Penetration tables changed. They could now penetrate up to 96mm of armor, likely, but that's possibly due to a different shell design or better shell quality, not the design of the gun. Either way, the tanks themselves you hear a lot of rumors about, mainly that they were used in battle as a part of Special Tank Company number 100. Unfortunately, there was no such tank company, and you've seen a lot of websites the same story replicated over and over and over again, that these tanks went to the front lines, but they never managed to see any German tanks, but they only shot some pillboxes. What happened in September and August when this alleged tank company number 100 was driving around the front lines, these tanks were still in trials. And this is pretty well documented. I have some translated trials records on my website. These tanks never saw battle. Now, the 57mm gun was competitive in 1943 against German medium tanks. So at that point, the Panzer IV had 80mm of front armor in the front hull and the front of the turret platform. Would have helped against that tank at long range. Fortunately, it was too late to put this gun into service because in the fall of 1943, you also had the 85mm S-53 gun development. Unlike the 85mm D5, which could only fit into fairly large turrets like the turret of the T-43 tank or the turret of the KV-85 or IS-1 tanks, S-53 was actually incredibly compact. It could fit into the turret of a standard T-34 tank with a hexagonal turret, and so there's no point in introducing an extra gun caliber into the tank forces when these 85mm guns were clearly the future. And unlike the 7mm gun, they also fired a very potent high explosive shell. These tanks were never referred to as tank destroyers. So that was the end of the 57mm gun in the T-34. That is it for this round of Soviet tank destroyers. Tune in next time when we'll talk about other different weapons in the Red Army that were referred to as such that I hinted at in the opening image.